Today, we're diving into one of the most fascinating and sometimes frustrating parts of being human, our memory. It literally shapes our entire identity, yet, as you know, it can be surprisingly fragile. So, let's find out why. I mean, we've all been there, right? You're introduced to someone, you shake their hand, say, "Nice to meet you," and poof, their name has completely vanished from your mind. It's embarrassing, it's frustrating, but as we're about to see, it's also completely and totally normal. And hey, it isn't just you. Take a look at this. This is the forgetting curve, and it was discovered way back by a pioneer named Hermann Ebbinghaus. He found that we forget things incredibly fast. Get this, within just 1 hour, about half of any new information you learn is just gone. And after about 9 hours, you're down to holding on to maybe 40%. This rapid drop isn't a flaw. It's just a universal feature of how our brains work. So to really understand why we forget, we first have to understand how a memory gets made in the first place. Think of it like a 3-stage journey that every single piece of information has to take to have any chance of becoming a lasting memory. So first up is encoding. This is where your brain takes in all that sensory information from the world and translates it into a language it can actually understand. Next is storage, which is, the process of holding on to that information. And finally, there's retrieval. That's pulling the information back out when you need it. A failure at any one of these steps means, well, the memory is lost. All right, let's start at the very beginning of the journey with what we can call the mind's temporary workbench. This is where information first lands and gets sorted through before your brain decides if it's even important enough to keep around. This chart shows you the first couple of stops. Sensory memory is this huge but incredibly brief buffer. It's like the glowing trail a sparkler leaves in the air. Everything you see, hear, and feel hits it, but most of it vanishes in less than a second. It's only the stuff you actually pay attention to that moves into short-term memory. And as you can see, that has a tiny capacity and only holds things for about 30 seconds, unless you're actively working to keep it there. These days, psychologists actually prefer the term working memory instead of short-term memory. And it's a much better description, really, because it's not just some passive waiting room for information. It's an active workbench where you're constantly juggling, combining, and manipulating ideas to solve a problem or make a decision, or even just follow a conversation. So if this mental workbench is so small, holding only about 7 little items at a time, how do we ever manage to handle complex information? Is there some kind of trick to expand its capacity? Let's try a little experiment right now. Look at this string of 12 numbers. For most people, trying to remember this whole sequence is way, way beyond the capacity of our working memory. Right now, it probably just looks like a random jumble of digits. But watch what happens when we just do this. By grouping or chunking these numbers into meaningful units, in this case they're years, the task suddenly becomes super easy. We've taken 12 separate items and turned them into just 3 manageable chunks. This technique, chunking, is a really powerful way to cheat the built-in limits of our working memory. Now let's move on to the next stage, the permanent library. Once a piece of information manages to survive that frantic workbench, it can finally move into the vast, sprawling library of your mind, long-term memory. And here's the crucial point. Just repeating something over and over again, that's called maintenance rehearsal, it's not very effective for getting things into that permanent library. The real key is something called elaborative rehearsal. This is where you actively connect the new information to knowledge you already have, creating this rich web of associations that makes it so much easier to find later. Now, inside this huge mental library, we have different sections. One big section is called declarative memory. This is your knowing what memory, all the facts, the figures, the events that you can consciously bring to mind and actually describe to someone else. And in contrast to that, we have procedural memory. This is your knowing how memory. It's all about skills. Think about riding a bike or typing on a keyboard. You can do it perfectly, right? But trying to explain exactly how you do it step by step in words, it's incredibly difficult. It's knowledge that's expressed through action, not words. And we can get even more specific. Even our declarative, knowing what memory, is split into 2 different types. You've got episodic memory, which is like your personal autobiography, memories of events tied to a specific time and place, and they often have a strong emotional feeling attached. And then, on the other hand, you have semantic memory. This is your internal encyclopedia of just plain facts about the world, like knowing that Paris is the capital of France.
Okay, so now that we know how memories are supposed to be formed and stored, we can finally tackle the big question, where do they go? Let's play detective for a minute and look at the main culprits behind forgetting. One of the biggest reasons we forget things is something called interference. This is basically when memories compete with each other and get in each other's way. There's proactive interference, where old knowledge messes with your ability to learn something new. And then there's retroactive interference, which is the opposite, when learning something new actually pushes out an old memory. But here's the thing. A lot of the time, the memory isn't actually erased at all. It's just inaccessible. This is called retrieval failure. The information is still filed away in your mental library, but you've lost the card catalog entry for it. That's why a small cue, a smell, a song, a word can suddenly unlock this flood of information you thought was gone forever. The cue is the key that opens the door. Now, for the good news. Understanding how these systems work gives us the power to actually improve them. We can use specific strategies, known as mnemonics, to encode information way more effectively and make it a whole lot easier to retrieve later. Okay, one of the most ancient and powerful techniques is the memory palace, or, as it's also known, the method of loci. This trick leverages our brain's excellent spatial memory. You just place mental images of things you want to remember along a very familiar journey, like a walk through your own house. So here's a super simple example. Let's say you have a shopping list. You could vividly imagine a giant loaf of bread blocking your kitchen door. Then you walk into the living room and see a carton of eggs smashed all over your table. Then you go to the bathroom and see tomatoes overflowing from the sink. To recall the list, you just take a mental walk through your house and see what crazy things you've placed there. Another incredibly powerful mnemonic is just organization. Remember chunking from earlier? That's a form of this. When you learn new material, don't just try to memorize it randomly. Impose a structure on it. Create categories or hierarchies or outlines. A well-organized library is one where you can always find the book you need, right? Ultimately, this isn't just some academic exercise or a set of neat brain tricks. As this quote from our source material really highlights, memory is the very foundation of our identity. It's the thread that connects our past, our present, and our future. It preserves the story of who we are. And that really leaves us with a final, pretty profound question to chew on. If we build our entire identity on this collection of memories, what does it mean that they can be so easily lost or even changed? What does that say about who we really are? Thanks for joining us for this explainer.